My name is Camille. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a self-taught software developer, I eventually escaped their toxicity, but the road there was built on the worst night of my life. My husband had a public affair with my best friend. I packed up my kids and drove to my parents' house seeking shelter. My father opened the door, looked at my 3 children standing behind me in the freezing rain, then quietly closed it. My younger sister called me impulsive. I picked up the garbage bags holding our entire lives, walked back to my car, and whispered 3 words: "Watch me build." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the elite circles of Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling mansion, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and imported marble, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Yvonne's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's and joined honor societies, and yet I was always the scapegoat, the disappointment. The rain that Tuesday evening felt like sharp needles against my skin. My 3 children huddled close to my legs on the porch of my parents' estate. 7-year-old Maya clung to my left hand, 5-year-old Marcus hid his face against my thigh, and I held my sleeping 2-year-old Leo against my chest. At my feet sat 3 black plastic garbage bags, containing whatever clothes I could grab before DeAndre returned to his mistress. When I confronted him, his response was to tell me to get out of his house. With no money in my personal account, I drove my sputtering 12-year-old Honda Civic to the only place I thought would offer me safety. The heavy mahogany double doors of my parents' house stood before me like a barricade. Inside, golden light spilled from the massive crystal chandelier in the foyer, casting a warm, mocking glow through the sidelight windows. I raised my free hand and knocked hard on the heavy wood, my knuckles aching. The heavy brass lock turned with a solid clunk, and the door swung open just enough to reveal my father, Elias. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, a glass of expensive scotch resting comfortably in his right hand. He looked at me soaking wet, shivering, with my 3 children clinging to me like refugees. His gaze swept over the black garbage bags at my feet, his expression immediately hardening into a mask of disgust. He did not step aside to let the warmth of the house reach us. He did not reach out to take his shivering grandchildren. He simply stood blocking the entrance. "What is the meaning of this spectacle, Camille?" my father asked, his voice low and dripping with irritation. Dad, DeAndre moved Sasha into the house. I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady for the kids. I had to leave. We need a place to stay just for a few nights until I can figure things out. My father sighed, taking a slow sip of his scotch. DeAndre makes 6 figures, Camille. He provides a magnificent lifestyle for you. If he is stepping out, you smile, prey on it, and keep his house clean. That is how marriage works in our circle. You do not throw a tantrum and drag your children into the rain like common street trash. I stared at him, unable to comprehend the absolute lack of empathy. He brought my best friend into our bed, Dad. I cannot stay there. You are overreacting as always. Elias scoffed. I have the mayor coming for a fundraising gala here tomorrow evening. Your brother Terrence has vital clients flying in. The last thing we need is you bringing your dramatic domestic failures to our doorstep and ruining our reputation. Take your trash bags, get back in that embarrassing car, and go home to your husband. Apologize for running off. He stepped back and shut the door. The finality of the latch clicking into place echoed louder than the thunder overhead. I stood paralyzed on the porch, the freezing rain continuing to assault us. I gathered my children, picked up the heavy plastic bags, and began the long, humiliating walk back down the circular driveway toward my rusted Honda, parked near the street. The car engine sputtered and choked before turning over the heater, blowing only lukewarm air. Just as I was putting the car in gear, the passenger side window was tapped lightly. I turned to see my mother Yvonne standing under a designer umbrella. I rolled down the window, the rain blowing inside. Yvonne leaned down, but she did not look at the children in the back seat. She reached into the pocket of her cashmere cardigan and shoved a crumpled $100 bill through the crack in the window. "Go to a motel, Camille," she instructed, her tone hushed and frantic. "And do not park this beat-up Honda out front. Your sister-in-law Tasha has friends driving by for the party preparations, and this eyesore is ruining the aesthetic of the driveway." I looked at the crumpled bill sitting on the passenger seat, then up at the woman who gave birth to me. "Why do you always have to be so difficult, Camille?" Yvonne continued, shaking her head. "Terrence and Tasha are upstairs planning a luxury vacation. Chloe is building her influencer brand, and you are here demanding handouts because you could not keep a successful man happy. Just take the money and leave before you embarrass us any further." I did not cry. The tears had frozen in my chest, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I picked up the $100 bill, rolled it tightly, and handed it back through the window. "Keep it for Tasha's next Botox appointment, Mom," I said smoothly, looking her dead in the eye. "Or maybe put it toward Terrence's credit card debts." "You are going to need every penny soon," Yvonne gasped, offended by my insolence. Without waiting for another word, I rolled the window up, shifting the car into drive and pulling away into the stormy night. We ended up at a cheap motel. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach, but it was dry. I bathed the kids in the small tub, wrapping them in layers of our packed clothes since the heater barely worked. I ordered a cheap pizza with the last $20 I had hidden. By 10 o'clock, the children were asleep, huddled together on one of the lumpy double beds. I sat at the wobbly desk under the harsh light of a single bulb. I pulled out my battered laptop, a modified machine I had pieced together from discarded parts over the years. My family thought my late nights typing away were just me playing games. DeAndre often mocked me for being an unemployed housewife wasting electricity. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that beneath my quiet demeanor, I possessed a genius-level aptitude for predictive coding and supply chain algorithms. I opened the terminal window. Lines of green text scrolled rapidly against the black background. For 2 years, I had been building a revolutionary artificial intelligence logistics platform designed to optimize global shipping routes and predict supply chain disruptions before they happened. I named it Aegis. I typed in the final command sequence to initiate the ultimate beta test, utilizing live global shipping data I had legally scraped from public registries. The fans on the old laptop whirred loudly, protesting the heavy processing load. My heart pounded against my ribs. If this failed, I had nothing. If it succeeded, I had the keys to the kingdom. I watched the progress bar inch forward. 90%, 95%, 99%. The screen flashed bright green, illuminating the dark motel room. A notification popped up immediately on screen. Aegis algorithm beta test 100% success. System fully optimized and ready for deployment. I took a deep breath, feeling the undeniable surge of pure power coursing through my veins. I composed a brief, highly technical email, attached the encrypted executive summary of the Aegis platform, and addressed it to the top 3 venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. I hit send. I looked back at my sleeping children, then out the window at the relentless rain. My family had laughed at my struggles. They had mocked my poverty and shut the door on my vulnerability, but they had absolutely no idea what I had just unleashed upon the world. 2 weeks passed since that freezing night in the motel. Every morning began with the fluorescent light of the cheap bathroom and the reality of feeding 3 children on a dwindling budget. I took freelance coding jobs, ignoring the exhaustion settling into my bones. Today was the temporary custody hearing at the Fulton County Courthouse. I sat alone at the respondent table, wearing the only tailored blazer I had managed to salvage from my old life. The courtroom doors swung open, and DeAndre strolled down the aisle with an air of absolute entitlement. He was not alone. Clinging to his arm was Sasha. She wore a tailored crimson dress, but my eyes immediately locked onto her neck. Resting against her collarbone was a diamond pendant. It was the heirloom piece my grandmother had left me, the one DeAndre claimed had been lost during the moving process. I felt a surge of pure heat in my chest, but I forced my face to remain entirely blank. DeAndre took his seat with a smug grin, while his high-priced attorney stood up to address the judge. The lawyer did not waste a single second. He pulled out a stack of glossy photographs and placed them on the judge's bench. These images showed the exterior of the rundown motel where my children and I were currently living. The lawyer launched into a vicious monologue, painting me as an unstable, homeless college dropout who had completely lost her grip on reality. He argued that I had abducted the children in the middle of the night in a fit of irrational jealousy. He formally requested full physical and legal custody for DeAndre, arguing that a motel room was an unfit environment for young children. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at me with clear skepticism. I sat perfectly still. The lawyer was not finished. He announced that he had brought a character witness to testify regarding my mental state and parenting capabilities. I expected him to call one of DeAndre's wealthy friends. Instead, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened again. My younger sister Chloe walked in. She was dressed in a white suit, looking every bit the polished influencer my parents funded her to be. She completely avoided my gaze as she walked past my table and took the witness stand. The betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth. Chloe swore an oath to tell the truth and then proceeded to lie with terrifying ease. She told the court that I had always been erratic and jealous of DeAndre's success. She claimed I was prone to sudden outbursts and that my decision to leave the house was a calculated, vindictive stunt. She looked the judge right in the eye and said I was simply incapable of providing a stable or nurturing home for my own children. I looked across the aisle. DeAndre was leaning back in his chair, practically glowing with victory. His lawyer stepped forward again, offering a magnanimous compromise. He stated that if I voluntarily surrendered full custody immediately, DeAndre would graciously provide $300 a month in spousal support to ensure I did not end up sleeping on the actual street. It was a calculated insult designed to force my complete submission. They wanted me broken and begging for scraps. The judge turned to me asking if I had retained counsel or if I had anything to say in my defense. I stood. I smoothed the wrinkles from my worn navy blazer and picked up a manila folder from the table. I informed the judge that I was representing myself. I walked toward the bench with measured steps. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the erratic emotion my sister had just described. I handed the folder to the judge and placed a duplicate copy directly in front of DeAndre's attorney. I politely requested that the court review the financial disclosures DeAndre had submitted under oath. I pointed out that my ex-husband claimed a severe lack of liquid assets to justify his insulting $300 support offer. I then directed the judge's attention to page 4 of my folder. While living in that cheap motel, I had unleashed Aegis. My proprietary algorithm was designed to predict global supply chain movements, but parsing complex, heavily layered digital data was its core function. I had simply directed Aegis to scrape public and semi-public financial routing data connected to DeAndre's corporate logistics accounts. It took my software exactly 5 seconds to bypass his shell companies and trace the money flow. I provided the court with routing numbers, transaction timestamps, and exact balances for 2 hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. These accounts held just over $800,000. Furthermore, I highlighted a specific wire transfer made 3 days ago for $14,000 to a luxury jeweler in Buckhead. I turned and looked directly at Sasha sitting in the gallery. I informed the judge that the $14,000 transaction matched the exact appraisal value of the diamond necklace currently resting on the mistress's neck. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The color completely drained from DeAndre's face. His expensive lawyer frantically flipped through the documents, his confident posture collapsing as he realized his client had committed blatant perjury. Chloe shifted uncomfortably on the witness stand, suddenly realizing she had backed a sinking ship. The judge slammed his hand down on the papers. His previous skepticism toward me vanished, replaced by furious indignation, directed entirely at DeAndre. The judge stated that hiding marital assets and committing perjury were severe offenses. He immediately halted the custody proceedings, striking DeAndre's petition from the record for the day. He ordered a full forensic audit of DeAndre's finances and mandated that my children would remain in my sole physical custody until the investigation concluded. DeAndre tried to speak, but his lawyer quickly grabbed his arm, forcing him to remain silent. I gathered my things with quiet dignity. I did not gloat. I did not cast a second glance at my sister, who was now scrambling down from the witness stand, trying to avoid the furious glare of DeAndre's attorney. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the bright, blinding Atlanta sunlight. The humid air felt entirely different today. It felt like freedom. The concrete steps of the courthouse stretched out before me, and for the first time in weeks, I could actually breathe. I walked toward the transit station, pulling my phone from my pocket to check on my children, who were safely at a drop-in daycare. Before I could unlock the screen, the device vibrated violently in my hand. The caller ID displayed an unknown number originating from San Francisco. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before pressing the answer button and lifting the phone to my ear. I offered a simple professional greeting. A man spoke on the other end. His voice was crisp, urgent, and vibrating with an electric kind of excitement. He introduced himself as Marcus Vance, a senior partner at one of the most prominent venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. He told me that his team had spent the last 48 hours tearing apart the encrypted executive summary and the beta test data I had emailed them from the motel room. He paused, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "Miss Williams," he said, his tone turning dead serious. "We saw the demo. We brought in our top engineers to try and break your algorithm, and they could not do it. Your supply chain predictive model is years ahead of anything currently on the market. We have never seen code this efficient." I stopped walking. The sounds of the busy Atlanta street traffic seemed to fade into a dull hum. I waited for him to continue, my grip tightening on the phone. "We do not want to fund Aegis," he stated clearly. "We want to buy it outright. We want exclusive rights to the underlying architecture." I took a slow breath, keeping my voice completely neutral as I asked him what kind of numbers they were considering. Marcus Vance did not hesitate. "Is $50 million a good starting point?" I looked back over my right shoulder at the massive, towering courthouse where my own family had just desperately tried to bury me forever. A slow, genuine, and deeply satisfying smile spread completely across my face. "Yes, Marcus," I replied calmly. "That is a very good starting point." I ended the call, placed the phone back into my pocket, and confidently walked forward into my new life. This was only the very beginning of my complete and total victory. The dark storms of the painful past were finally behind me now, forever. 4 months passed since that day on the courthouse steps. $50 million changes a lot of things. It changes your zip code, your legal representation, and your ability to sleep through the night. But it does not change the fundamental rot within a toxic family. I funneled the buyout money from the Aegis algorithm sale into a highly secured blind trust. I named the corporate entity Apex Holdings. I hired the most ruthless wealth managers and corporate attorneys in Atlanta to act as my public face. On paper, to anyone looking, Camille Williams was still a broke, unemployed single mother sharing a cramped, leaky apartment with 3 young children. In reality, I was the silent, anonymous architect of a rapidly expanding empire, aggressively diversifying my newly acquired capital into commercial real estate, tech acquisitions, and corporate debt. I kept my sputtering 12-year-old Honda Civic. I kept my faded, threadbare sweaters and discount store shoes. I needed my family to believe they had won. I needed them to feel completely secure in their superiority. Thanksgiving arrived with a heavily embossed gold foil invitation from my mother. It was not a gesture of maternal warmth or reconciliation. It was a formal summons to witness their continued elite status. I drove the sputtering Honda up the long, winding, tree-lined driveway of my parents' estate in Buckhead. The crisp November air was thick with the smell of burning wood and expensive cigars. A team of valets in crisp white shirts and black ties rushed around the circular driveway, carefully parking a gleaming line of Mercedes, BMWs, and Range Rovers. The head valet, a man who had worked my parents' parties for years, looked at my rusted car with thinly veiled disdain before handing me a ticket. I walked up the wide marble steps, wearing a simple cheap gray cardigan and scuffed black flats. The massive mahogany double doors were already propped open, spilling the rich scent of roasted turkey sage stuffing and expensive perfume out into the evening air. I stepped into the grand foyer. Laughter and the clinking of crystal echoed from the formal dining room. I could see the massive table set for 20, adorned with gold-rimmed china-polished silver cutlery and towering floral centerpieces. I walked into the main living area and stopped dead in my tracks. DeAndre was standing proudly by the massive stone fireplace, nursing a glass of aged bourbon and laughing loudly at a joke my father had just made. Clinging tightly to his arm, wearing a blindingly white, custom-tailored Prada silk dress, was Sasha. My ex-husband had actually brought his pregnant mistress to my family Thanksgiving dinner, and my parents had welcomed them with open arms and poured them drinks. Sasha spotted me first. She leaned into DeAndre, whispering something in his ear that made him look over at me and smirk. He looked me up and down, clearly taking in my cheap cardigan and worn shoes, his eyes flashing with victorious satisfaction. Before I could even take another step into the room, my sister-in-law, Tasha, swept across the imported rug. She was wearing an identical white Prada silk dress to Sasha's, a clear, highly coordinated effort to visually alienate me from the group. Tasha held a crystal flute of vintage champagne in her manicured left hand and a flimsy, cheap white paper plate in her right. She marched right up to me and shoved the paper plate directly into my chest, forcing me to take it. "Grab your food from the buffet set up in the kitchen island," Camille, Tasha commanded, her voice intentionally loud enough to silence the nearby conversations of my aunts and uncles. "We do not have a seat for you at the main table tonight." I looked down at the pathetic paper plate, then back at the sprawling dining table. There were exactly enough plush, velvet-backed chairs for everyone else in the room, including the mistress who had destroyed my marriage. "The main table is reserved strictly for people who actually contribute to the family legacy," Tasha continued, taking a slow theatrical sip of her champagne. "Terrence just signed a massive multi-million-dollar logistics contract with a national freight distributor today. He secured our family name and our wealth for the next decade. We simply do not have room at the adults' table for unemployed single mothers who bring nothing but drama, poverty, and failure to our doorstep." My mother, Yvonne, drifted past us carrying a heavy silver platter of artisan hors d'oeuvres. She heard every single word Tasha said. She did not intervene. She did not defend her daughter. She merely adjusted her heavy diamond earrings, offered Sasha a polite smile, and looked completely away from me. My younger sister Chloe laughed openly from the leather sofa across the room, raising her own champagne glass toward Tasha in a silent, mocking toast. DeAndre walked over, wrapping a highly possessive arm around Sasha's waist. "Tasha is absolutely right, Camille," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should probably just eat in the kitchen with the hired catering staff. You are much more at their level anyway." Sasha giggled, reaching up to adjust the heavy diamond pendant resting on her neck. It was the exact necklace my grandmother had left me. I did not argue. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. The broken, desperate Camille from 4 months ago would have fled the house in absolute humiliation. But the anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings simply smiled. I took the paper plate from Tasha without a word of protest. I turned and walked slowly toward the elaborate, fully stocked beverage station set up near the grand piano. I completely bypassed the champagne buckets and the white wine chillers. I picked up a heavy-cut crystal decanter filled to the brim with a deep, inky, full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon. I grabbed the largest wine glass on the table and poured, filling it right up to the absolute rim. I turned back toward the center of the room. Tasha and Sasha were standing shoulder to shoulder now, clinking their crystal flutes and laughing at my expense, basking in their cruel victory. I walked toward them with measured, perfectly deliberate steps. My eyes were locked onto the pristine, blinding white fabric of their matching designer dresses. Just as I reached the space directly in front of them, I purposefully twisted my left ankle inward. I let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, pitching my entire body forward. I threw my right arm out violently, exactly as if I were desperately trying to catch my balance. The full glass of dark red wine flew from my hand in a perfect wide sweeping arc. The heavy dark liquid crashed directly into Sasha's chest, splashing outward in a massive violent wave that completely covered Tasha's matching dress. The dark red stains bloomed instantly and irrevocably across the pristine white silk, ruining thousands of dollars of custom couture in a single beautiful second. A collective horrified gasp echoed through the massive living room. Sasha shrieked at the top of her lungs, dropping her champagne flute as she frantically clawed at the ruined wine-soaked fabric clinging to her chest and stomach. Tasha let out a horrific sound that was half scream and half sob, staring down in absolute horror at the dark crimson streaks running all the way down her skirt to her designer heels. I slowly righted myself, calmly brushing an invisible speck of dust from my cheap gray cardigan. "Oops," I said, my voice calm, steady, and perfectly audible over their frantic shrieking. My unstable, unemployed hands must have slipped. Tasha lunged forward, her face contorted with pure rage, ready to strike me. But my father stepped quickly between us. Elias grabbed my upper arm, his strong fingers digging painfully into my skin. He yanked me backward roughly, his face purple with fury. "You vindictive, pathetic, jealous woman!" Elias spat, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "You are a complete and total disgrace to this family. But you will not be a problem for us for much longer. Terrence is loaning DeAndre the money to take you back to family court next week. He is personally funding the entire legal battle to take your kids away from you permanently. You will have absolutely nothing." I looked down at my father's hand, aggressively gripping my arm. Then I looked past him at my golden child brother Terrence, who was standing by the dining table looking incredibly smug and powerful. I did not pull away from my father's grip. I did not panic. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my cardigan with my free hand and pulled out my cell phone. I tapped the screen once to bypass the lock. I looked directly into my father's furious eyes and smiled. It was a cold, predatory, terrifying smile that made him involuntarily loosen his grip on my arm. The sharp, loud ping of a news alert suddenly chimed in the quiet, tense room. Then another ping, and another. Every single cell phone in the room began vibrating and chiming simultaneously. Terrence pulled his expensive phone from his tailored suit pocket, annoyed by the interruption. I watched intently as the blood completely drained from his face. His jaw went slack, his eyes widened in sheer terror, and his fingers trembled so violently that he dropped his crystal glass. It shattered loudly against the marble floor, sending shards of glass everywhere. I looked down at my own screen, calmly reading the breaking financial news headline I had personally orchestrated just hours ago through my blind trust. Family-owned Williams Logistics loses major national contract. Anonymous corporate entity initiates hostile commercial debt review amid massive embezzlement allegations. I looked back up at my brother, whose entire world and false empire had just collapsed into dust in a matter of seconds. The crystal glass shattered against the marble floor, but nobody moved. Terrence stared at his phone, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. My father snatched the device from his hand, his eyes scanning the breaking news alert. The color drained from Elias' face just as quickly. The chaotic screaming from Sasha and Tasha faded into the background, completely eclipsed by the financial ruin flashing on that small screen. I did not stay to watch them scramble. I simply turned around, walked out the open mahogany doors, and drove my battered Honda back to the city. Let them panic. The real storm had not even arrived yet. Fast forward 4 months. It had been exactly 8 months since I stood shivering in the rain outside that very house. I was no longer sitting at a wobbly motel desk. I sat in the penthouse office of Apex Holdings, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. My desk was a massive slab of polished obsidian, completely clear except for my customized dual monitors. Aegis, my proprietary AI, had been working relentlessly. As the anonymous corporate entity reviewing Williams' logistics, I had unprecedented access to their internal servers. Terrence thought he had hidden his tracks by burying his personal expenses in nested corporate vendor accounts. He thought he was a financial genius. He was exceptionally wrong. I initiated a deep dive forensic audit using Aegis. The algorithm tore through 10 years of accounting data in less than 3 minutes. The screen illuminated with bright red flags highlighting a catastrophic pattern of fraud. Terrence had not just mismanaged the company or lost a few contracts to bad luck. He had systematically embezzled over $2 million from the family business. I clicked on the highest expenditure files, watching the money trail unfold like a map of pure vanity. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off under the guise of fleet maintenance. I traced the routing numbers. The money went directly to Tasha's luxury lifestyle. Those matching white Prada dresses ruined at Thanksgiving were paid for by the company. The custom matte white Range Rover she drove to her daily country club lunches was registered as a commercial delivery vehicle. Even her weekly spa treatments and Botox injections were illegally logged as corporate wellness retreats. But Terrence did not stop with his wife. He was also heavily funding my younger sister. I pulled up a massive set of invoices labeled as independent marketing consultants. Chloe had absolutely zero real sponsors. Her entire social media influencer brand was a heavily funded illusion. Terrence was using company money to buy her fake followers pay for her extravagant sponsored trips to Dubai and secure her VIP tables at exclusive clubs so she could pretend she was famous. He was draining the family legacy dry just to keep up the appearance of limitless wealth for his wife and sister. The sheer incompetence was staggering. My father had trusted Terrence blindly because he was the eldest son, never once verifying the ledgers. I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a sip of sparkling water. The financial ruin was obvious, but as I scrolled through the final quarter of the fiscal year, a specific anomaly caught my eye. The company had been hemorrhaging cash so badly that they had nearly missed a massive payroll deadline in October. Yet miraculously, a sudden infusion of exactly $50,000 had appeared in the primary operating account just hours before the employee checks were set to bounce. I directed Aegis to trace the origin of that specific wire transfer. The progress bar blinked, searching through external banking nodes and financial clearinghouses. When the source account populated on my screen, my blood ran completely cold. The breath caught in my throat. The routing number belonged to a small, extremely private collegiate trust fund. It was the exact fund my late grandmother had set up specifically for Maya, Marcus, and Leo. Before she died, she had pulled me aside and told me she wanted to make sure my children had a safety net, explicitly naming me as the sole custodian of the account. It was untouched, sacred money meant for their education. I pulled up the digital authorization forms used by the bank to liquidate the account. There, staring back at me in high definition, was my own signature. It was a crude, rushed forgery. Terrence had forged my name, completely drained my children's future, and dumped it into his failing logistics company just to cover up his own massive theft for one more week. He had stolen from his own niece and nephews to pay for Tasha's designer shoes and Chloe's fake internet fame. A blinding, white-hot rage ignited in my chest. This was no longer just about corporate revenge or bruising their massive egos. This was a direct, unforgivable attack on my children. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. I did not bother changing out of my tailored business suit. I bypassed my usual anonymous driver and got directly into my matte black Maybach. I drove straight to Buckhead, pulling up to the massive iron gates of my parents' estate. The gates were surprisingly open, a stark contrast to the locked door I had faced in the freezing rain 8 months ago. I marched up the marble steps and pushed open the front doors without bothering to knock. Elias and Yvonne were sitting in the formal living room. The atmosphere was completely different from our last encounter. There was no champagne, no laughter, no wealthy friends admiring their decor. They sat surrounded by stacks of printed financial documents, looking haggard, exhausted, and utterly terrified. They looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. Before either of them could utter a word of reprimand about walking into their home uninvited, I threw a thick manila folder directly onto the glass coffee table. The glossy printed pages spilled out, displaying the forged bank transfers, the fraudulent vendor invoices, and the liquidated trust fund documents. "Look at them," I commanded, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Look at what your golden boy did to survive his own incompetence. He forged my signature and stole $50,000 from Maya, Marcus, and Leo. He robbed his own family to cover the millions he already embezzled to buy Tasha's cars." My father stared in the papers, his face turning an ashen gray. He reached out with a trembling hand, reading the undeniable proof of his son's federal felonies. He looked completely broken, the reality of his ruined legacy finally setting in. But it was my mother who reacted exactly as I knew she would. Yvonne stood up, her jaw set stubbornly, her eyes flashing with that familiar, irrational defense of her eldest child. She did not even look at the evidence spread across the table. She looked at me with pure disdain. "He is the eldest son," Yvonne shouted, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "He needed the money to save the family name. You are just being a bitter, vindictive woman over a few pennies. We will pay you back when the business recovers." A simple mistake. Stealing from toddlers to fund a fake influencer in a Prada wardrobe was just a few pennies to her. I looked at the woman who had handed me $100 bill and told me to take my hungry children to a roach-infested motel. I looked at the father who had shut the door in my face to protect a dinner party. They were completely, irrevocably, morally bankrupt. They would happily watch me and my children burn to the ground if it meant keeping Terrence on his pedestal. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply looked at Yvonne with absolute freezing silence. The lack of emotion on my face caused her defensive posture to falter. She took a tiny step backward, suddenly realizing that the daughter she was berating was no longer there. I turned on my heel and walked out of the living room, leaving the forged documents resting on the glass table. I walked down the long driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a direct encrypted line. It was answered on the first ring by my lead wealth manager at Apex Holdings. "Buy Williams Logistics commercial debt from the bank," I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "Buy the mortgage on my parents' estate. I want to be their sole creditor by Friday." Friday arrived precisely on schedule, and with it came the absolute suffocating financial strangulation of the Williams family. Behind the towering, heavy mahogany doors of their Buckhead estate, sheer panic had entirely consumed them. Through my elite team of attorneys and wealth managers at Apex Holdings, I watched their frantic, desperate maneuvers unfold in real time. The operation had been executed flawlessly. The bank, eager to shed a highly toxic asset, had gleefully offloaded Williams Logistics' massive commercial debt. At the exact same time, my managers swooped in and purchased the heavily leveraged underwater mortgage of my parents' sprawling estate. Both of these massive financial anchors fell directly into my completely anonymous, highly secured hands. I was now their landlord, their primary corporate creditor, and their absolute master. I held the strings to their entire fake empire. Elias and Terrence were officially drowning in a sea of red ink and impending federal audits. They had absolutely no liquid capital left. Their credit lines were entirely frozen, and they had no conceivable way to cover the massive, multi-million-dollar embezzlement hole Terrence had so arrogantly dug. The walls were rapidly closing in, and they were running out of oxygen. Their solution to this catastrophic financial ruin was staggeringly on brand for my deeply superficial, image-obsessed family. The Williams family was in full panic mode behind closed doors, but publicly they refused to show a single crack in their armor. They decided to throw a massive party. Instead of liquidating their remaining assets, downsizing their luxurious lifestyle, or filing for immediate bankruptcy protection, Elias and Terrence convinced themselves that they could simply charm their way out of the abyss. To save face and secure a new lifeline, they planned a massive, extravagant 35th anniversary gala for their failing company. They intended to invite the city's political elite, the most prominent local socialites, and most importantly, the ruthless anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings. They genuinely believed that if they projected an image of absolute untouchable wealth and unshakable corporate success, they could seduce this mysterious corporate titan into restructuring their debt and securing a new massive loan. The delusion was almost breathtaking to witness. They maxed out their final high-interest corporate credit cards to rent the grand ballroom at the city's most expensive hotel. They ordered thousands of dollars in imported white orchids, secured a top-tier celebrity catering service, and demanded a premium open bar. Tasha, completely unfazed by the fact that her husband had bankrupted the family, threw a massive tantrum until Terrence bought her a brand new custom beaded gown to replace the one I had ruined at Thanksgiving. Chloe spent the entire week recording videos for her fake followers, bragging about the exclusive VIP-only corporate gala her family was hosting. They were violently rearranging the deck chairs on a rapidly sinking ship, completely unaware that I was the iceberg waiting in the dark. While my family busied themselves with ordering expensive artisan ice sculptures and debating the menu, my ex-husband was fighting a miserable losing battle of his own. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I sat by the window of a small, quiet coffee shop in downtown Atlanta. I was wearing my usual worn gray sweater, quietly reviewing highly confidential acquisition targets for Apex Holdings on my secure tablet. The bell above the cafe door chimed aggressively. DeAndre walked in, completely shattering the peaceful atmosphere. He looked absolutely terrible. The arrogant, untouchable swagger he had carried into the courthouse just months ago had completely vanished, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. His previously immaculate, expensive, tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, looking wrinkled and suspiciously unwashed. Dark, heavy circles ringed his bloodshot eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he scanned the room. He spotted me sitting in the corner, marched directly across the cafe, and slammed a crumpled legal document forcefully onto my small wooden table, nearly knocking over my black coffee. He demanded that I sign the paper immediately. It was a formal legal waiver drafted to permanently surrender my right to the pathetic $300 a month in spousal support he had mockingly offered during our temporary custody hearing. DeAndre leaned heavily over the table, looking incredibly stressed. His breath smelled strongly of stale alcohol and sheer unadulterated panic. He admitted, his voice cracking with desperation, that his accounts were entirely frozen because of the forensic audit I had triggered in the courtroom. He revealed that Sasha was pregnant and constantly demanding a luxury lifestyle he could no longer afford to provide. He was completely broke. His credit was destroyed, his offshore accounts were under active investigation, and he was actually desperate enough to track me down and beg me to release him from his minor financial obligation to me. I looked up at him, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my heart, no lingering sadness over the end of our marriage, and certainly no pity. I just felt a cold, clinical observation of a broken, toxic man facing the consequences of his own actions. He entirely mistook my calm silence for weakness. He sneered, his lip curling in disgust as he mocked my appearance, looking up and down at my simple, cheap gray sweater. "You will never be anything but a dropout, Camille," he spat, his voice dripping with familiar venom. "You are wearing actual rags and sitting alone in a cheap cafe while Sasha is carrying my true heir. Just sign the damn paper so I can get back to my actual life and forget you ever existed. You are a complete failure and you will always be poor." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at his insults. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my favorite heavy silver pen. I smoothed out the wrinkled waiver he had slammed onto the table, aligning the edges perfectly. I looked up at him, my expression perfectly neutral, and told him I would happily sign away the alimony. I watched a brief, pathetic flash of triumphant relief wash over his exhausted face. He actually thought he had intimidated me into submission. But before I signed my name on the bottom line, I smoothly wrote an additional legally binding clause directly into the wide margin of the contract. I legally stipulated that in exchange for waiving all current and future spousal support, I required a full, unredacted multi-agency financial audit of his offshore shell companies, effectively waiving my right to contest the findings, while handing the entire mess directly over to federal tax investigators. I signed my name with a sharp flourish and slid the paper back across the table. "I do not need your pennies, DeAndre," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. "But the IRS might want a very close look at your shell companies. I suggest you find a much better lawyer." His profound relief instantly shattered, replaced by an expression of pure unadulterated horror. He grabbed the paper, his hands shaking violently, as he read the new clause that would guarantee his federal prosecution. The color completely drained from his face as the reality of the trap set in. I calmly picked up my coffee, walked right past him, and stepped out into the bright morning sun, leaving him frozen in terror. Later that evening, my phone vibrated loudly on my kitchen counter. It was a message popping up in the Williams family group chat. Terrence had sent a mass text to everyone, his tone practically vibrating with unearned arrogance and false superiority. "Everyone wear black tie to the gala tomorrow night," the message read. "The CEO of Apex is attending, and we are closing a massive deal to secure our legacy forever." My mother replied with a string of celebratory emojis, and Chloe sent a selfie showing off her diamond necklace. Then a final message popped up directed entirely at me. "Camille, do not bother coming," Terrence wrote. "They check net worth at the door." I smiled a slow, deeply satisfying smile, my thumb hovering over the screen. I typed a simple, definitive reply and hit send. "I will be there. Ita." The St. Regis Hotel in downtown Atlanta had been aggressively transformed into a glittering, excessively lavish monument to a completely fraudulent empire. The Williams Logistics 35th Anniversary Gala was nothing more than a masterclass in desperate deception. A fleet of valets sprinted across the polished, rain-slicked pavement, opening doors for local politicians, commercial real estate magnates, and the city's elite corporate aristocracy. Inside the sprawling grand ballroom, tens of thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, hanging from massive crystal chandeliers, in a desperate attempt to mask the undeniable stench of impending financial ruin. Elias and Terrence stood near the grand entrance, their custom-tailored Italian tuxedos entirely unable to hide the nervous cold sweat beating heavily on their foreheads. They were frantically shaking hands, laughing much too loudly at unfunny corporate jokes, and aggressively scanning the crowd for the one person who held their absolute survival in the palm of their hands. They were waiting with bated breath for the anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings. My mother Yvonne drifted through the VIP reception area, flawlessly playing the role of the untouchable generational wealth matriarch. She was heavily draped in blindingly bright, cascading diamonds that I knew for an absolute fact were borrowed and aggressively insured by a desperate local jeweler looking for exposure. She smiled tightly, sipping vintage French champagne and acting as though her husband was not currently staring down the terrifying barrel of total federal bankruptcy. Across the room, my sister-in-law Tasha had outdone herself in the vanity department. She wore a suffocatingly tight emerald green designer gown, violently mingling with the wives of regional bank executives. She was completely blissfully oblivious to the fact that her pristine luxury lifestyle was entirely funded by stolen corporate money that had officially run completely dry. Chloe, utterly detached from reality as usual, was standing near a towering, intricately carved ice sculpture, loudly live-streaming the entire pathetic charade to her purchased fake internet followers. She held a professional lighting ring in her left hand, tossing her hair and aggressively boasting about her family's unshakable historic legacy. Lingering near the very edge of the ballroom, completely out of place among the actual titans of industry, was DeAndre. He looked entirely pathetic. He was clutching a cheap cocktail, attempting to corner anyone wearing a decent suit. Without the formidable backing of my family's former influence, he was completely radioactive in the corporate world. His prestigious law firm had officially suspended him without pay, pending the offshore account audit I had forced him to agree to in the coffee shop just 24 hours prior. I watched him through the heavily tinted, bulletproof glass of my approaching vehicle as he desperately tried to hand his crumpled, useless business card to a senior logistics director. The director politely but firmly turned his back, leaving DeAndre standing alone in a crowd of hundreds. DeAndre was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room, hunting for a financial lifeline that simply did not exist anymore. Sasha was nowhere to be seen, likely confined to whatever cheap, cramped apartment they were now renting, waiting for the lavish life he had arrogantly promised her but could no longer afford to provide. My custom matte black Maybach glided smoothly onto the cordoned-off red carpet, bypassing the chaotic line of standard luxury vehicles. The massive, heavy vehicle commanded instant absolute attention from everyone standing near the entrance. The bright flashbulbs of the local press photographers snapped wildly, the blinding white light cutting through the humid Atlanta evening. A sharp, highly tense silence instantly rippled through the gathered crowd. Terrence abruptly stopped speaking mid-sentence, abandoning a conversation with a local senator. Elias stepped forward quickly, aggressively adjusting his silk bow tie, his eyes wide with desperate, greedy anticipation. They truly believed their anonymous financial savior had finally arrived to rescue their sinking ship. The head valet rushed forward to open the heavy rear door, but my private security detail had already stepped out from the trailing black SUV, flawlessly taking position and waving the valet away. The heavy, armored door swung open smoothly. A single metallic silver stiletto stepped deliberately onto the wet red carpet. I emerged from the dark shadows of the vehicle, standing tall under the blinding lights. I was not wearing a scuffed pair of flats or a threadbare sweater. I was wearing a breathtaking, meticulously crafted custom haute couture gown. The deep sapphire silk hugged my frame perfectly, flowing down to the wet pavement like liquid glass. A delicate, asymmetrical neckline highlighted my collarbone, unadorned by any jewelry, because the sheer power of the dress required zero accessories. My hair was swept up in a sharp, flawless style, and my makeup was immaculate, cold, and razor-sharp. The silence that fell over the red carpet was absolute and deeply suffocating. The press photographers froze their cameras, hovering uselessly in the air. Terrence stood completely paralyzed, his jaw practically hitting the floor, as his brain struggled to comprehend the visual reality standing right in front of him. Elias stumbled backward, a half step, the color instantly draining from his face, as if he had just seen a terrifying ghost. Tasha, who had been rushing toward the entrance to greet the mysterious billionaire, stopped so abruptly her emerald dress snagged on a decorative plant stand. Chloe actually dropped her phone, the device cracking loudly against the marble floor, cutting off her superficial live stream in an instant. DeAndre pushed his way through a small crowd of executives, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as he stared at the woman he had discarded and mocked just a day ago. The shock quickly mutated into a chaotic, aggressive panic. Tasha was the first to break the paralyzing silence. Her face twisted into an ugly, furious sneer, her pristine facade instantly crumbling into pure, venomous jealousy. She pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face, her voice shrieking loudly enough to echo off the hotel lobby walls. "What is she doing here?" Tasha screamed, her eyes darting frantically around the elegant entrance. "Remove her immediately. She probably rented that dress and sneaked past the perimeter. She is trespassing. Get her out of here before she ruins the entire gala." Yvonne rushed forward, clutching her borrowed diamonds tightly against her chest, her face flushed with extreme humiliation and mounting rage. "Camille, you have lost your absolute mind," my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with pure malice. "You are going to destroy our one chance to save this company. Security, grab her and throw her out onto the street where she belongs." Terrence furiously waved his hand in the air, signaling the heavily armed hotel security detail standing near the velvet ropes. Two massive men in dark suits immediately broke from the perimeter, walking aggressively toward me with their hands raised. Tasha crossed her arms over her chest, a deeply smug, victorious smile spreading across her face as she prepared to watch me be physically dragged away and humiliated in front of the entire Atlanta elite. DeAndre watched from the sidelines, a sick look of hopeful satisfaction replacing the terror in his eyes. They all firmly believed the old, natural order of the world was about to be restored. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not break my icy, unwavering stare from my father's panicked face. I simply stood perfectly still, exuding absolute authority as the security guards rapidly closed the distance. The towering head of the hotel's security team, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, strode quickly past the two approaching guards, raising a single hand to halt them. He stepped directly into my personal space. Tasha leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with wicked excitement, waiting for Marcus to forcefully grab my arm and throw me out into the rain. Marcus did not reach for my arm. He did not raise his voice. Instead, the massive, highly trained security chief stopped squarely in front of me, planted his feet firmly, and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. He reached into the pocket of his dark suit jacket and pulled out a small, highly sophisticated encrypted communication earpiece. He gently and respectfully placed it directly into my outstretched palm. Tasha gasped, her smug smile vanishing instantly. Terrence let out a confused, strangled noise. Elias stared at the security chief, completely unable to process the total subversion of authority happening right before his eyes. Marcus turned slowly on his heel, facing my father and sister-in-law. His expression was completely devoid of emotion, a blank wall of absolute professionalism. "Mom," Marcus said, his deep, resonant voice projecting clearly across the dead, silent red carpet, directing his words entirely at Tasha. "This is the Madam CEO of Apex Holdings. She personally owns this entire venue, the hotel, and the surrounding commercial block." Marcus turned back to me, bowing his head one more time before stepping aside to clear my path into the grand ballroom. "Ms. Williams," Marcus stated clearly, ensuring every single person in the vicinity heard him. "The stage is fully prepped for your keynote address whenever you are ready." I gave Marcus a curt, appreciative nod. The absolute silence in the grand foyer was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket that had instantly smothered the arrogant laughter of my family. I stepped forward, my sapphire gown gliding effortlessly across the polished marble floor. The heavy silk moved like liquid, catching the light of the massive chandeliers above. My family remained frozen, like grotesque statues caught in the glare of an oncoming train. Tasha's mouth was still hanging open in a silent, comical scream of outrage, her eyes darting frantically between my dress and the formidable phalanx of elite security guards now flanking my sides. I did not spare her a single solitary glance. I walked directly past my mother, whose face had completely drained of all its carefully curated, highly expensive cosmetic color. She looked fragile, ancient, and entirely out of her depth. As I passed my father, the sheer shock finally gave way to his desperate, deeply ingrained need for absolute control. Elias could not comprehend a world where he was not the supreme authority. He lunged forward, his face flushing a dark, violent red with sudden indignation. He reached out with a heavy hand to grab my bare arm, intending to drag me away like a disobedient child. "Camille, what is this trick, Elias?" hissed his voice, a frantic, ugly whisper meant only to intimidate me. "Stop playing games right now, and tell these men to back off." Before his thick fingers could even brush my skin, Marcus moved with terrifying, highly trained speed. The massive security chief stepped firmly between us, his broad shoulders easily blocking my father from coming any closer. Marcus swatted my father's hand away with a sharp, definitive strike that echoed loudly in the quiet foyer. "Do not touch the CEO," Marcus commanded, his voice rumbling with unmistakable lethal authority. Elias stumbled backward, clutching his wrist in genuine absolute shock. He looked at Marcus, then looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. He was completely unable to comprehend that his patriarchal authority had just been physically and publicly revoked in front of his wealthy peers. I did not stop walking. I did not even look back at him. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open wide as my security detail cleared the path. The opulent space was packed shoulder to shoulder with the Atlanta elite. These were the very people my father and brother had invited to witness their desperate, highly funded illusion of success. I moved smoothly through the sea of imported white orchids and towering crystal displays. The whispers started at the edges of the room and quickly swelled into a loud, frantic buzz. People parted like the Red Sea, their eyes fixed on the woman surrounded by serious men with earpieces. They recognized power when they saw it, and right now I was the only source of gravity in the room. I caught sight of Terence standing near the very front of the stage. The arrogant, condescending smirk he had worn all evening had completely melted off his face. His expensive tailored Italian tuxedo suddenly looked 2 sizes too small. He was sweating profusely, the heavy beads rolling down his forehead and stinging his eyes. I watched the exact beautiful second his brain finally processed the brutal reality of the situation. He looked at my security detail. He looked at my custom couture gown, and he remembered the hostile takeover notices he had received all week from Apex Holdings, the ruthless anonymous corporate entity that had bought his massive commercial debt. The shadow company that had cornered his logistics empire was the exact same sister he had actively tried to destroy, the sister he had robbed to fund his wife's vanity. His knees visibly buckled. He had to grab the edge of a nearby high-top cocktail table just to remain standing, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the linen tablecloth. I ascended the small set of carpeted stairs leading to the main stage. The lighting director, clearly briefed by Marcus well beforehand, immediately killed the ambient house lights and hit me with a single blinding, pristine white spotlight. The entire room of Atlanta's high society fell completely silent. The clinking of champagne glasses ceased entirely. The soft jazz music from the hired band ground to a sudden awkward halt. Hundreds of expectant faces stared up at me, waiting for the mysterious billionaire savior to speak. I stepped behind the clear acrylic podium and adjusted the microphone. I looked out over the massive crowd, my eyes easily finding my family. They had followed me into the ballroom, standing near the back doors, looking exactly like a group of terrified prisoners waiting for the judge to hand down their sentence. DeAndre was standing a few feet away from them, looking physically ill. His hands were shaking so badly he had to shove them deep into his pockets. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp metallic sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous ballroom. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm, melodic, and projecting crystal-clear confidence through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate the 35th anniversary of Williams Logistics. Many of you in this room know me. Or rather, you think you know me. You know me as the profound disappointment of the Williams family. I am the college dropout you whisper about at your country club dinners. I am the erratic outcast who never fit into the perfect corporate mold. I am the unemployed single mother who was turned away in the freezing rain by her own flesh and blood, told that my hungry children were a burden they could not bear." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The absolute candor of my words shattered the polite, fake etiquette of the gala. I saw a few prominent bankers exchange highly uncomfortable, panicked glances. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her throat, leaning heavily against a decorative pillar, looking like she might actually faint from the sheer embarrassment. Chloe tried to hide behind a floral arrangement, her influencer bravado completely evaporated. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, letting my gaze lock directly onto Terence, pinning him to the spot like a butterfly on a mounting board. "But tonight, I am not speaking to you as the disgraced daughter," I continued, my voice echoing with icy surgical precision. "I am not speaking to you as the desperate woman begging for scraps from her family's table. Tonight, I speak to you as the sole creator and founder of the Aegis AI algorithm. And more importantly, to everyone in this room, I speak to you as the acting chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." The name of my company hit the room like a physical, devastating shockwave. The financial executives in the crowd immediately recognized the corporate entity. They knew exactly what Apex Holdings was. It was the highly aggressive, massively capitalized firm that had been ruthlessly acquiring corporate debt all over the eastern seaboard for the past 4 months. I saw a local state senator actively step away from my father, wanting absolutely zero association with a man who had just been publicly outed as a target of Apex. The predators in the room instantly realized who held the power, and they immediately realigned their loyalties. I reached down and picked up a small, sleek black remote control resting on the acrylic podium. For the past few months, my family has been desperately trying to project an image of untouchable wealth. I continued, my voice rising slightly, commanding total obedience from the crowd. They threw this magnificent, wildly overpriced gala tonight to convince you, their investors and their peers, that their legacy is secure. They invited the CEO of Apex Holdings here tonight, hoping to charm their way into a massive debt restructuring loan. They wanted to hide the brutal truth of their complete financial incompetence. But I prefer absolute transparency. I pressed the button firmly. The massive high-definition digital screen spanning the entire wall behind me instantly flared to life, casting a bright blue glow over the stage. The projected images were 50 feet tall and entirely impossible to miss or deny. On the massive left screen, I displayed the official court-stamped foreclosure documents for my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate. The highlighted red text clearly showed that Apex Holdings now owned the mortgage entirely, and the property was in severe, irreversible default. The debt had been called in. On the massive right screen, I projected the commercial debt acquisition contracts for Williams Logistics. But I did not stop there. I layered the screen with the forensic audit results Aegis had compiled. I made sure the exact dollar amounts of Terrence's catastrophic failures were visible to every single person in the room. The charts clearly showed the $2 million completely embezzled from corporate accounts funneled directly into Tasha's luxury vehicle payments and Chloe's fraudulent marketing invoices. The financial rot of the golden child was displayed in bright red, glowing high definition. The silence morphed into a chaotic, aggressive uproar of whispers, gasps, and shocked exclamations. The facade was entirely obliterated. My father let out a loud, choked gasp, grabbing his chest as he stared at the foreclosure documents displaying his home. Terrence looked like he was going to vomit right there on the expensive carpet, clutching his stomach as his theft was broadcast to his peers. Tasha hid her face behind her hands, sobbing uncontrollably instantly, realizing her entire luxury lifestyle was completely dead and gone forever. I did not raise my voice, but the microphone picked up my final definitive statement with ruthless, terrifying clarity, cutting through the noise of the panicking crowd. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I said, staring directly into my brother's terrified, weeping eyes, I am the sole owner of Williams Logistics. The sheer weight of those words slammed into the grand ballroom like a physical concussive blast. For a fraction of a second, the entire room remained entirely paralyzed, trapped in a vacuum of utter disbelief. Then, the shockwave hit. The collective gasp from hundreds of Atlanta's most elite power players morphed instantly into a deafening, chaotic roar of scandalized whispers and aggressive murmurs. Terrence snapped. The polished, arrogant facade he had spent his entire life cultivating disintegrated completely, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, frantic animal. His face flushed a dark mottled crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his tight silk collar. "You are lying!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over the crowd. He shoved his way past the front row of VIP tables, knocking over a crystal centerpiece that shattered violently against the marble floor. He lunged for the carpeted stairs, charging the stage like a madman. His arms flailed wildly, his eyes wide with a crazed, desperate denial. "This is a setup. This is illegal market manipulation. You committed corporate sabotage. I will have you arrested, Camille. I will have you thrown in a federal prison for this." He did not make it past the first step. Marcus, moving with the terrifying, silent speed of a striking predator, stepped smoothly into his path. The massive security chief did not even have to exert real effort. He simply planted his broad chest in front of my brother and placed a single, immovable hand flat against Terrence's chest. The impact stopped Terrence dead in his tracks, sending him stumbling backward, gasping for air as his expensive Italian loafers slipped on the polished floor. 2 more Apex security operatives flanked Marcus instantly, creating an impenetrable human wall between my unhinged brother and the podium. Elias rushed forward, his face ashen, grabbing Terence by the arm to prevent him from getting himself arrested on the spot. Elias looked up at me, his eyes pleading desperate and still completely patronizing. "Camille." "What is this trick?" Elias whispered fiercely, though the microphone picked up the desperate hiss of his voice. "Stop playing games. End this right now before you ruin the family name permanently." I looked down at the two men who had shut the door in my face when my children were hungry. I felt no anger. I felt no lingering resentment. I felt only the cold, clinical precision of an auditor closing a ledger. I did not acknowledge my father's pathetic plea. Instead, I pressed the silver button on my remote control. The massive 50-foot digital screens behind me shifted instantly. The complex foreclosure documents and corporate debt acquisitions vanished, replaced by a massive, brightly colored pie chart. It was simple, elegant, and absolutely devastating. "Let's talk about legalities, Terence," I said, my voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system, slicing effortlessly through the chaotic murmur of the ballroom. "Since you are so suddenly concerned with the boundaries of federal law, let us examine exactly how Williams Logistics was driven into the ground." I gestured gracefully to the glowing screens behind me. The pie chart was titled Williams Logistics Q3 and Q4 Capital Expenditures. In the blue section, 12%, legitimate fleet maintenance and payroll. The yellow section, 34%, unexplained offshore vendor transfers. The red section, 54%, executive personal enrichment. "You claim I sabotaged the company." I continued pacing slowly behind the clear acrylic podium. "But numbers do not possess the capacity to lie, Terence. Only executives do." I clicked the remote again. The pie chart dissolved into a rapid, undeniable sequence of raw financial receipts. High-definition scans of bank wire transfers, signed corporate checks, and eroded offshore account ledgers flooded the massive screens. I highlighted specific, undeniable transactions in bright, glowing yellow. "Here is a corporate wire transfer for $85,000 marked under the ledger as heavy machinery upgrades." I narrated, my voice echoing like a judge handing down a sentence. "The routing number, however, does not belong to a mechanic. It belongs to a luxury dealership in Buckhead. This exact transfer corresponds to the purchase date of the matte white Range Rover your wife currently drives." The crowd gasped. I clicked the remote again. "Here's a series of recurring weekly payments totaling over $200,000 this fiscal year alone, logged as independent marketing consultancies. The payee is Chloe Williams. These funds were entirely utilized to purchase fake social media followers and fund luxury vacations to Dubai to maintain a completely fraudulent influencer aesthetic." I paused, letting the sheer weight of the embezzlement settle over the room. I looked directly at Tasha. She was trembling violently, her emerald green gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. "And here," I said, my voice dropping an octave, radiating a quiet, lethal fury, "is a series of corporate vendor payments totaling over $400,000 routed directly to high-end jewelers and luxury fashion houses across Europe. Diamonds, Terence. You bankrupted your grandfather's legacy to drape your wife in diamonds." Terence was shaking his head frantically, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He looked at the investors in the room, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of innocence. But no one was looking at him with sympathy. They were looking at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. In the world of high finance, failure is tolerated. Blatant, stupid theft is an unforgivable sin. But I was not finished. The financial ruin of the company was merely the appetizer. The main course was the personal betrayal. I clicked the remote one final time. The screens went entirely black for a fraction of a second before displaying a single stark white document. It was a digital authorization form from a private collegiate trust fund. "Embezzling from your own company is a federal crime, Terence," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. "But stealing from your own blood, stealing from toddlers, that requires a special kind of moral bankruptcy." I pointed to the screen. "This is the private educational trust fund set up by our late grandmother explicitly for my 3 children. Untouchable money meant for their future. $50,000. I zoomed in on the bottom of the document. two signatures sat side by side. On the left is my actual signature, I stated clearly. On the right is the signature used to completely liquidate the account and dump the funds directly into Williams Logistics' failing payroll account, just days before checks were set to bounce. A crude, panicked, incredibly stupid forgery. The collective intake of breath from the Atlanta high society was deafening. Embezzlement was a corporate scandal. Forging a signature to steal an inheritance from a single mother's young children was a profound, unforgivable social and moral crime. Tasha could not handle it. The impenetrable illusion she had based her entire identity upon had been nuked from orbit. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and terrified. The society women she had been aggressively networking with just 20 minutes ago, the wives of banking magnates and real estate tycoons, were actively physically stepping away from her. They pulled their expensive silk shawls tighter around their shoulders, their faces twisted in absolute revulsion. Whispers hissed through the crowd, sharp and venomous. "Did you hear that he stole from children? She's wearing stolen diamonds. They are absolute criminals." Humiliation washed over Tasha in a violent, suffocating wave. She let out a high-pitched, panicked sob, grabbed the heavy skirts of her custom emerald gown, and turned to flee. She tried to sprint toward the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom, desperate to escape the blinding glare of her own ruin. She did not make it far. Chloe's relentless, aggressive social media promotion of the exclusive Williams Gala had successfully lured the local press and several prominent business reporters to the hotel lobby. When the screaming had started, inside the media had breached the perimeter. As Tasha tried to push through the heavy mahogany doors, she collided directly with a solid wall of journalists, camera crews, and paparazzi. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, stroboscopic assault. Microphones were shoved aggressively into her face. "Tasha, Tasha, did you know your husband forged documents? Ms. Williams, are you wearing stolen jewelry? Do you have a comment on the federal embezzlement charges?" Tasha shrieked, throwing her hands up to cover her face, completely trapped by the flashing cameras, unable to run and unable to hide. She was cornered by the exact spotlight she had spent her entire life desperately chasing. Back at the foot of the stage, Terrence was a broken man. The reality of federal prison, the loss of his status, and the complete, undeniable destruction of his ego had finally crushed him. He sank to his knees on the carpeted steps, the sharp crease of his tuxedo pants folding awkwardly. Tears streamed freely down his face, mixing with the heavy sweat. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and pleading, stripped of all the unearned superiority he had wielded like a weapon since childhood. "You stole it," Terrence sobbed, his voice a weak, pathetic wheeze. "You stole my birthright, Camille. You stole my company." I looked down at my older brother. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, absolute certainty of a woman who had built an empire from the mud he had thrown at her. I leaned into the microphone. "I didn't steal the company, Terrence," I said quietly, the finality of the statement ringing through the dead, silent room. "I bought it for exactly what you made it worth." The finality of that statement hung in the heavy, humid air of the grand ballroom, absolute and unyielding. Terrence remained crumpled on the carpeted stairs, a pathetic, weeping heap of ruined ambition and exposed fraud. The titans of Atlanta high society stared at him with profound disgust, entirely repulsed by the staggering depth of his betrayal. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the untouched crystal glasses. Then the sharp, rhythmic sound of a single pair of hands clapping slowly echoed through the cavernous space. The crowd parted once again. DeAndre stepped out from the shadows of the peripheral tables, pushing his way to the very front of the stage. The absolute, unadulterated terror I had seen in his eyes just moments ago on the red carpet had completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a blinding, ravenous greed. He had been watching the massive digital screens displaying the financial acquisitions, the forensic audits, and the staggering multi-billion-dollar corporate valuations of Apex Holdings. In his deeply narcissistic, legally calculating mind, he had just done the math. He saw a loophole and he firmly believed he had just won the ultimate unimaginable lottery. He straightened his wrinkled suit jacket, puffing out his chest as he approached the security perimeter. He flashed the charming predatory smile that had originally completely fooled me years ago. He genuinely thought he still held power over me. He believed that the same woman who had once dutifully cooked his dinners and washed his laundry was standing behind that acrylic podium just waiting to be manipulated. Camille, baby. DeAndre called out, his voice, loud, confident, and dripping with a sickeningly sweet, false affection. He spread his arms wide, acting as if we were merely a couple having a minor public disagreement. That is an incredible presentation, a truly brilliant corporate maneuver. I am so incredibly proud of you, sweetheart. But in all your excitement, you seem to have forgotten one tiny, very important legal detail. He took another step forward, stopping exactly at the edge where Marcus and the security team stood. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with raw, unrestrained avarice. "We are still legally married on paper, Camille," he announced, making sure his voice carried to every single corporate lawyer and banking executive in the room. In the state of Georgia, without a finalized divorce decree, assets acquired during the marriage are considered marital property. It does not matter what shadow companies you used or how anonymous you tried to be. Half of Apex Holdings is legally mine. Half of Williams Logistics is mine. Half of everything on those screens belongs to me. We do not have to fight anymore, baby. We can fix our family right now. We can rule this city together." A collective stunned murmur swept through the ballroom. The sheer audacity of his claim was staggering. He had publicly degraded me, thrown me out of our home with nothing filed for divorce, and fought tooth and nail to deny me basic spousal support. Now, standing in the glow of my immense self-made wealth, he was publicly staking a legal claim to my entire empire. He was trying to assert ownership over the very sword I was using to execute my enemies. Before I could even respond to his breathtaking delusion, a sharp commotion near the entrance drew the crowd's attention. Sasha pushed her way violently through the throng of stunned executives. She had clearly bypassed the distracted door staff tracking DeAndre down to the gala. She was wearing a tight, flashy maternity dress, her face flushed with exertion and sudden, overwhelming excitement. She had heard DeAndre's booming voice echoing across the ballroom. She had heard the words billion-dollar valuation and marital property. Sasha practically sprinted to the front of the stage, instantly latching onto DeAndre's arm. Her eyes were wide, completely fixated on the towering digital screens, detailing the massive wealth of Apex Holdings. She realized instantly that the man she was standing next to was legally claiming half of an empire. She clung to him desperately, resting her hand aggressively on her pregnant stomach, looking up at me with a deeply smug, viciously triumphant smirk. She was ready to play the role of the billionaire's new wife, entirely willing to stand by his side and collect the spoils of a war she had absolutely nothing to do with. The sheer concentrated toxicity radiating from the two of them was almost palpable. They stood together at the foot of my stage, a united front of pure, unadulterated parasitism, waiting for me to bow to the constraints of marital law. I looked down at them, standing shoulder to shoulder in their shared greed. I did not yell. I did not summon my security to throw them out. I simply leaned forward against the clear acrylic podium and let out a laugh. It was a chilling, echoing laugh that completely silenced the room. It was not a laugh of amusement, but a sharp, clinical sound of absolute victory. The sound cut through DeAndre's arrogant confidence like a razor blade, causing his smug smile to falter slightly. Sasha gripped his arm tighter, suddenly looking deeply uncertain. I reached into my custom sapphire clutch resting on the shelf of the podium. My fingers closed around a thick, folded piece of premium legal paper. I pulled it out, holding it up under the glaring white spotlight for the entire room to see. The bright light caught the unmistakable, heavy embossed gold seal of a Fulton County Superior Court judge. "Oh, DeAndre," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm, conversational tone that reverberated heavily through the massive speakers. "You really are a remarkably terrible lawyer. Your arrogance has always been your greatest blind spot." I slowly unfolded the document, smoothing the heavy paper against the podium. Remember that paper you violently slammed onto my table at the coffee shop just yesterday morning? I asked, locking my eyes directly onto his. The waiver you were so incredibly desperate for me to sign. The one you aggressively mocked my clothing over. You were in such a frantic, blind panic to get out of paying me a pathetic $300 a month in temporary spousal support that you completely failed to perform due diligence. You did not read the fine print, DeAndre. DeAndre's face suddenly went rigid. The color began to drain from his cheeks, leaving a sickly ashen gray behind. He let go of Sasha's hand, stepping forward, his eyes darting frantically to the document in my grasp. Let me explain basic contract law to you. I continued, addressing him with the slow, deliberate cadence of a teacher scolding a particularly slow student. I did not just sign away my alimony yesterday. By executing that specific waiver under the exact conditions I required, you inadvertently signed a binding, absolute post-nuptial agreement. You signed a document explicitly acknowledging complete and total financial separation. And because you were so incredibly desperate to push it through the courts by the afternoon, you agreed to the clause that backdated that total financial separation to the exact day you locked me out of our house. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The highly educated corporate lawyers in the crowd instantly understood the devastating legal trap I had set. DeAndre had legally severed himself from my assets entirely by his own hand. You do not own half of Apex Holdings, DeAndre, I stated, my voice echoing with finality. You do not own a single microscopic fraction of my empire. You legally surrendered any and all claims to my assets 24 hours ago in exchange for $300 a month. You traded a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate for the price of a cheap car lease payment. DeAndre physically staggered backward, his mouth opening in a silent gasp of pure horror. He reached up, grasping his own hair completely, unable to process the magnitude of the catastrophic mistake he had just made. He had literally handed me the keys to my absolute freedom on a silver platter because he was too arrogant and too cheap to read a margin note. But I was not finished. The trap had two completely distinct jaws, and the second one was ready to snap shut. Sasha looked at DeAndre in rising panic, realizing the immense wealth she thought she had just secured was instantly vaporizing before her eyes. She grabbed his sleeve, shaking him, demanding an explanation he was entirely incapable of giving. Furthermore, I said, raising the remote control and aiming it at the massive screens behind me, we need to address the second clause I added to your precious waiver yesterday. The clause you blindly initialed because you were terrified I would discover why your accounts were temporarily frozen. I clicked the button. The pie charts and embezzlement receipts detailing Terrence's crimes vanished instantly, replaced by a massive, highly complex digital web of international banking nodes, wire transfers, and offshore shell company registrations. The screen illuminated with the unmistakable seal of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. You thought you were so incredibly smart, hiding your assets in nested accounts in the Caymans and the Bahamas. I said, my voice ringing out like a death toll. You thought a few layers of corporate anonymity could protect your illegal, untaxed wealth from a divorce settlement. But you forgot that I am the sole architect of Aegis AI. My algorithm untangled your pathetic offshore web in exactly 14 seconds. DeAndre fell to his knees on the carpet, clutching his chest. He was hyperventilating, his eyes completely wide with a primal, inescapable terror. He knew exactly what was on that screen. He knew his entire life was completely over. By signing that document yesterday, you legally authorized the full release of those forensic findings directly to federal tax investigators, I explained, looking down at his broken form. I handed the IRS a perfectly documented, unassailable map of your federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and illegal offshore sheltering. The agents were incredibly grateful for the comprehensive data package. I paused, letting the absolute destruction of his life settle into the dead silent ballroom. The prominent executives and politicians in the crowd were staring at the screens in utter shock, witnessing the real-time public execution of a man who thought he could outsmart the system. The IRS did not hesitate. I stated, my voice dropping to a final icy whisper. They acted on the emergency injunction immediately. They seized your primary accounts, your secondary holdings, and your hidden offshore assets. They froze absolutely everything this afternoon. I leaned closer to the microphone, looking directly into the horrified, panicked eyes of the man who had thrown me out into the cold. "You don't have half of my company." "DeAndre," I said, the words echoing sharply off the high ceilings. "You don't even have a checking account." Sasha stood frozen at his side. She looked at the massive screens displaying the federal investigation, looked down at the broken, hyperventilating man on his knees, and then looked up at me, standing in untouchable, unimaginable wealth. The calculation in her eyes was instantaneous and entirely ruthless. She was looking at a man facing federal prison and absolute total poverty. Sasha immediately dropped DeAndre's trembling hand. She did not say a single word. She simply turned on her heel, her face a mask of cold self-preservation, and walked rapidly away from him, disappearing into the shocked crowd without looking back once. DeAndre remained entirely frozen on the carpet. His expensive suit was crumpled, his hands gripping his knees as he stared at the empty space where his pregnant mistress had just stood. He was completely alone. The suffocating reality of his situation pressed down on him, stripping away the last remnants of his hollow arrogance. He was not just broke. He was facing an imminent federal indictment. The predators of Atlanta high society, the very people he had spent years desperately trying to impress, now looked at him as if he were a contagious disease. They stepped over him, physically moving away to avoid being associated with a sinking ship. I stood behind the acrylic podium, my face a mask of absolute chilling calm. I surveyed the ballroom. The Williams family empire was completely annihilated. Terrence was a ruined, blubbering mess clutching a cocktail table for support. DeAndre was effectively a federal target without a dime to his name. Tasha had fled the room, running headfirst into a relentless media firing squad. The foreclosure documents for my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate were still glowing in high definition on the 50-foot screens behind me. My mother Yvonne realized the total inescapable finality of the situation. I watched her perfectly manicured hands tremble as her eyes darted frantically around the room. She was a woman who had spent her entire existence thriving on social currency, leveraging her husband's wealth, and her son's supposed success to secure her position at the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's elite circles. In the span of 20 minutes, she had been transformed from a revered society matriarch into the mother of an embezzler, the wife of a bankrupt failure, and a woman facing immediate, highly publicized eviction. She had no money left. She had no power left. She had no logical argument or legal maneuver to save her. So she resorted to the only weapon she had left in her carefully curated arsenal, the ultimate desperate manipulation. Yvonne let out a sudden, piercing, theatrical gasp. She staggered backward, her hands flying up to clutch the heavy diamond necklace resting against her chest. Her face, previously frozen in a mask of horrified shock, suddenly contorted into a grotesque mask of manufactured agony. She began to hyperventilate loudly, her breaths coming in sharp, erratic rasps that echoed clearly into the sudden quiet of the room. "My heart," Yvonne screamed, her voice cracking with perfect melodramatic precision. "My heart." She stumbled toward a nearby catering table, grabbing the crisp white linen tablecloth as her knees buckled. A tray of crystal champagne flutes crashed to the marble floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The violent sound of breaking glass amplified the chaos. "I cannot breathe," Yvonne wailed, looking directly at the crowd of influential bankers and politicians, ensuring she had a captive audience for her grand performance. "My own daughter is killing me. The stress. She is murdering her own mother." With a final agonizing cry, Yvonne collapsed completely, landing on the floor amidst the spilled champagne and broken crystal. She lay there clutching her chest, her eyes fluttering shut as she began to emit weak, pathetic moans. The reaction was immediate. The crowd of elite guests, previously united in their disgust for Terrence and DeAndre, suddenly wavered. High society is notoriously fickle, and the sight of an elderly, impeccably dressed woman collapsing in apparent cardiac distress triggered a wave of genuine shock. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Several people took a step forward, their faces etched with sudden concern. The narrative was dangerously close to shifting. A ruthless corporate takeover was one thing, but causing a fatal heart attack was entirely different. Elias saw the opening immediately. My father, desperate to regain any semblance of control over the narrative, practically threw himself onto the floor beside his wife. He did not check her pulse. He did not call for a doctor. He used the moment exactly as it was intended to be used. He looked up at me standing behind the podium, his face twisted in a mask of absolute self-righteous fury. "Look what you have done!" Elias roared, his booming voice designed to shame me in front of the city's most powerful people. "You are a monster, Camille. A cold, heartless monster. You come in here and destroy your brother's life. You humiliate this family. And now you are putting your own mother in an early grave. Where is your respect for your blood? Where is your basic human decency?" He placed a protective hand over Yvonne's forehead, glaring at me with a manufactured blazing hatred. "Someone call an ambulance," Elias yelled to the crowd, playing the role of the devoted, terrified patriarch to absolute perfection. "She is having a heart attack." "My daughter has driven her to a heart attack." A low, uncomfortable murmur spread through the ballroom. I could see the prominent executives exchanging hesitant, uneasy glances. The brutal financial execution I had just orchestrated was suddenly being overshadowed by the primal emotional weight of a family medical emergency. Elias was successfully painting me as a sociopathic villain, a woman so consumed by greed and revenge that she would literally kill her own mother. I did not rush over to them. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of panic, regret, or concern. I simply stood behind the podium and watched the performance. I knew my mother better than anyone in this room. I knew that she had faked a debilitating migraine to get out of attending my high school graduation because she had a conflicting spa appointment. I knew she had faked a severe asthma attack to avoid a tax audit meeting 5 years ago. Medical manipulation was her default escape hatch whenever she was backed into a corner she could not charm her way out of. I raised my right hand, catching the blinding glare of the spotlight, and snapped my fingers once. A sharp, definitive crack that echoed clearly over the speakers. I did not need to call an ambulance. When you are the acting chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar holding company with a Tier 1 security detail, you do not rely on public emergency services. From the shadows behind the massive digital screens, a man stepped forward. He was not a security guard. He was dressed in a sharp, dark gray tactical uniform, carrying a heavy, rigid medical trauma bag. He was my private on-call, executive paramedic, a standard requirement for Apex Holdings leadership. He moved with calm, clinical efficiency, walking directly down the carpeted stairs toward where my mother lay moaning on the floor. "Get away from her," Elias barked, trying to shield Yvonne as the paramedic approached. "We do not want your people touching her. We need real doctors." Marcus stepped forward, instantly easily towering over my father. He gently but firmly gripped Elias by the shoulder and physically moved him aside. "Please step back and allow the medical professional to assess the patient." Marcus rumbled his voice, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. Elias struggled briefly, but he was no match for the highly trained security chief. He was forced to stand back, his face red with impotent rage, as the paramedic knelt beside Yvonne. Yvonne intensified her performance. She arched her back, letting out a dramatic, breathless groan, clutching her chest even tighter. The paramedic did not offer soothing words. He did not look panicked. He unzipped his trauma bag and pulled out a portable, highly advanced cardiac monitor and a pulse oximeter. "Ma'am, please try to remain still," the paramedic said in a flat, purely professional tone. He smoothly attached the clip to her index finger and placed a sensor flat against her neck to read her vitals. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The silence was so profound that the soft, rhythmic beeping of the portable medical device was clearly audible. Beep, beep, beep. Slow, steady, and entirely undisturbed. The paramedic looked at the digital readout on his screen. He looked at Yvonne's face, noting her perfectly normal skin tone and lack of actual sweat. He then stood up, unclipped the monitor from her finger, and packed his equipment back into his trauma bag with methodical precision. He turned to face the stage, looking directly at me. I gestured toward the microphone on the podium. The paramedic stepped up the stairs, taking his place in the bright white spotlight. He leaned into the microphone, his expression entirely bored and unimpressed. Her blood pressure is 120/80. The paramedic announced, his clinical voice carrying to the very back of the massive ballroom. Her oxygen saturation is at a perfect 99%. Her heart rate is a perfectly normal 85 beats per minute. She is exhibiting absolutely zero signs of cardiac distress, respiratory failure, or neurological shock. He paused, looking down at my mother, who had suddenly frozen on the floor, her fake groans ceasing instantly. "She is completely fine," the paramedic stated definitively into the microphone. "She is faking." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly brutal. The hesitant sympathy that had been building just moments ago evaporated into thin air, instantly replaced by a wave of absolute, unadulterated revulsion. The gasps this time were not of shock, but of profound disgust. Faking a heart attack to manipulate a business deal and guilt-trip your own daughter was a social crime of the highest order. It was pathetic, cowardly, and entirely transparent. A prominent state senator in the front row actually laughed out loud, a harsh mocking sound. The prominent bankers shook their heads, turning their backs on the scene on the floor. My mother had played her final card, and it had exploded directly in her face, publicly branding her as a hysterical, manipulative liar in front of the only people whose opinions she valued. Yvonne opened her eyes. The realization that her performance had been clinically dismantled hit her hard. She slowly sat up, the broken champagne glass crunching under her designer dress. Her carefully styled hair was slightly out of place, and her face was flushed with genuine burning humiliation. She looked at Elias, who was standing a few feet away, entirely speechless, completely stripped of his patriarchal authority. I stepped out from behind the clear acrylic podium. The heavy silk of my sapphire gown whispered against the carpet as I descended the small set of stairs. The crowd parted automatically, giving me a wide berth. The air crackled with the heavy, undeniable weight of total victory. I walked slowly, my heels clicking deliberately against the polished marble floor as I left the carpeted area. I stopped directly in front of my mother. She was still sitting on the floor looking up at me. The arrogant, condescending woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure, an outcast, a disappointment, was now literally sitting at my feet, entirely ruined by her own actions. Marcus stepped up behind me, silently extending his hand. I reached back and he placed a thick, heavy red folder into my grasp. I looked down at Yvonne. I did not feel a shred of pity. I dropped the thick red folder directly onto her chest. It hit her with a heavy, satisfying thud. The folder contained the finalized, legally binding eviction notices for the Buckhead estate executed by Apex Holdings. "You can drop the act, Mother," I said, my voice cold, sharp, and echoing clearly in the quiet room. "Because you are going to need your energy to pack." Yvonne stared blankly at the heavy crimson stock paper resting on her chest. Her manicured fingers shaking so violently they rattled her enormous diamond rings, slowly reached up and flipped open the cover. The harsh glare of the stage spotlight illuminated the bold black legal typography printed across the top of the very first page. It was a formal court-approved 72-hour notice of eviction. The remaining color completely drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking hollowed out and incredibly frail. She looked at the signature at the bottom of the document, then up at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The massive Buckhead estate was not just a home to her. It was her palace, her fortress, the absolute epicenter of her social power in Atlanta. It was 30,000 square feet of imported Italian marble, custom rose gardens, and climate-controlled wine cellars, where she hosted the city's most exclusive charity dinners. It was the physical manifestation of her superiority. "When you shut the door on my hungry children in the freezing rain, you told me to go find a cheap motel," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying an icy resonance that made the surrounding executives shiver. "I remember standing on your pristine porch, completely soaked, holding my crying son, while you looked through the glass and turned the deadbolt. You told me my failure was not your financial burden." Yvonne squeezed her eyes shut, a genuine tear of pure terror finally escaping and ruining her expensive mascara. "So I took your advice, Mother," I continued, stepping closer so I could look directly down into her panicked eyes. "I handled my own financial burdens. I bought the mortgage to your sprawling estate last month through a subsidiary of Apex Holdings. You and Father were so incredibly arrogant, so deeply leveraged in your desperation to maintain a fraudulent lifestyle that you did not even bother to read the acquisition notices. You defaulted on the loan 3 weeks ago. The grace period expired this morning." I paused, letting the absolute devastation settle into her bones. "The house is mine," I stated clearly, "and I am evicting you." A sudden hysterical wail shattered the heavy silence of the ballroom. Chloe, my younger sister, shoved her way frantically through the crowd of stunned investors and reporters. Her carefully curated influencer aesthetic was entirely ruined. Her designer silk dress was wrinkled. Her perfect contouring was streaked with desperate, messy tears, and her phone was clutched in her hand like a lifeline she did not know how to use. She threw herself to her knees next to our mother, looking up at me with an expression of profound, unadulterated disbelief. Chloe had spent her entire adult life insulated by my father's money and my brother's embezzlement, floating through a bubble of luxury shopping halls, sponsored resort trips, and vapid internet fame. The concept of actual consequence was completely foreign to her reality. "Where am I supposed to go?" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking in a shrill, entitled panic. "My entire influencer studio is in that house. My ring lights, my custom closet, my backdrop walls. You cannot do this to us, Camille. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. We are sisters." I looked at Chloe, feeling nothing but a profound, freezing emptiness. I looked at the young woman who had publicly mocked my thrift store clothes on her social media channels to generate engagement, the sister who had actively participated in my ex-husband's smear campaign to boost her own follower count. I looked at Chloe with absolute ice. "You called me impulsive and stupid for leaving a cheating, abusive husband?" I said, my voice slicing through her hysterical sobbing with surgical precision. "You posted a 20-minute video telling your millions of followers that I lacked the sophistication to maintain a high-value marriage. You profited off my absolute lowest moment." Chloe flinched, shrinking back against our mother, as the elite crowd murmured in collective disgust at her actions. "So try using that incredible high-value influence to find yourself a cheap studio apartment," I advised, staring her down until she broke eye contact. "Because you have exactly 72 hours to vacate my property. If you or your things are on the premises by Monday morning, my private security team will physically carry you out to the curb and leave your designer bags in the driveway." I turned my back on her, but threw one final devastating directive over my shoulder. "And leave the appliances," I commanded, stripping away the last vestige of their dignity. "The Sub-Zero refrigerators, the Viking ranges, the custom washer and dryer units. Do not even think about trying to sell them to cover your moving costs. They are fixtures of the estate and they belong to me." Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into her silk skirts. Yvonne remained paralyzed on the floor, clutching the red folder against her chest as if it were a physical wound. The total, unmitigated destruction of the Williams women was complete. They had been stripped of their home, their wealth, their social standing, and their pride in front of the exact audience they worshipped. From the edge of the stage, Elias finally moved. The towering, intimidating patriarch of the Williams family, a man who had ruled his corporate boardroom and his household with an iron fist and a terrifying temper, looked physically broken. His broad shoulders were slumped. His expensive tuxedo looked suddenly too large for his deflating frame, and his hands were trembling visibly at his sides. He had watched his golden child son face federal prison. He had watched his company get swallowed whole by the daughter he discarded. He had watched his wife publicly humiliated, and his youngest daughter reduced to a weeping mess. He had nothing left. No leverage, no money, no power, and absolutely no respect from the titans of industry watching him fall. Elias took a slow, agonizing step forward. He did not yell. He did not command. He looked up at me standing behind the glowing acrylic podium, and his knees visibly buckled. The proud, arrogant tycoon slowly sank down until he was kneeling on the carpeted steps of the stage, bowing before the daughter he had thrown into the street. "Camille, please." Elias begged, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper that was picked up perfectly by the microphone. The sound of his complete surrender echoed through the ballroom, a shocking, pathetic display of a broken ego. "Please stop this. You have made your point. You have proven you are the smartest one in the room. You have won everything. But please do not put us on the street." He reached a shaking hand toward the hem of my dress, though Marcus immediately stepped forward, ready to intervene. I held up a single finger, stopping my security chief. "I wanted to hear this. We are your family." Elias pleaded, his eyes brimming with desperate, panicked tears. "We share the same blood. I am your father. I will step down. I will publicly apologize. We can fix this mess. We can start over, Camille. We can be a real family again. Just please show some mercy." I stared down at the man who had authored every single nightmare of my adult life. I looked at the man who had taught Terrence how to steal, who had taught Chloe how to manipulate, who had taught Yvonne that cruelty was power. I looked at the man who had looked me dead in the eye and told me my hungry children were a consequence of my own stupidity. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating chain I had been dragging behind me since childhood finally snapped, dissolving into dust. "Family are the people who open the door when it is raining," I said, my voice calm, melodic, and completely devoid of any remaining emotion. "Family are the people who make sure your children do not go to sleep with empty stomachs. You are not my family, Elias. You are just the people I unfortunately share DNA with." I stepped back from the podium, signaling the end of the conversation, and I am entirely out of charity. I turned away from his kneeling, broken form. I looked at Marcus and gave him a single definitive nod. I did not need to speak another word. Marcus tapped his earpiece. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open violently. A highly coordinated, perfectly synchronized team of Apex Holdings private security operatives flooded into the room, dressed in sharp black suits, moving with absolute terrifying efficiency. They bypassed the stunned elite guests, marching directly toward the front of the stage where the remnants of the Williams family remained crumpled on the floor. "Clear the room," Marcus commanded, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "This event is officially terminated by order of the ownership. Escort the trespassers off the premises immediately." I did not stay to watch them drag my father out by his arms. I did not stay to watch Tasha get blinded by the paparazzi waiting in the lobby. I turned my back on the screaming, the crying, and the complete collapse of their fraudulent empire. I walked smoothly across the stage, my sapphire gown gliding over the floor, heading toward the private VIP exit at the rear. I had a multi-billion-dollar logistics company to restructure in the morning, and I needed to get home to my children. Stepping out into the cool Atlanta night air from the private VIP exit of the grand ballroom was like taking my first real breath in decades. The frantic shouting of my ruined family was muffled entirely behind the heavy, soundproof steel doors, completely neutralized by the steady, powerful hum of my waiting Maybach engine. Marcus opened the rear door for me, his expression a mask of silent, absolute professional approval. I slid into the rich custom leather interior, the ambient lighting casting a soft, victorious glow over my sapphire gown. I looked at the driver in the rearview mirror. "Take me home to my children," I instructed. The 72-hour countdown had officially begun, and I had a multi-billion-dollar empire to run, while the clock ticked down on their fraudulent existence. Exactly 3 days later, the heavy, humid Georgia morning broke with a glaring, unforgiving sunlight. I sat comfortably in the back of my Maybach, parked discreetly across the wide, pristine, tree-lined street from the sprawling Buckhead estate. I held a crystal glass of sparkling water, the condensation leaving cool, refreshing droplets on my fingertips. The heavily tinted windows provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the absolute devastation unfolding on the manicured driveway. The scene playing out before me was a masterpiece of poetic, unadulterated justice. There were no luxury moving companies with white glove service to pack their belongings. Apex Holdings had frozen their primary accounts, and the Internal Revenue Service had immediately seized whatever scraps remained. Instead, a battered, faded rented U-Haul truck sat parked awkwardly on the pristine cobblestones, leaking dark oil directly onto the expensive driveway my father used to obsessively maintain. Yvonne and Elias were reduced to performing manual labor in the blistering morning heat. My mother, a woman who once aggressively refused to carry her own designer handbag from the car to the foyer, was awkwardly dragging cheap, mismatched cardboard boxes out the grand double front doors. She was wearing a silk Chanel blouse that was already heavily stained with sweat and dust, her expensive salon-perfect blowout completely ruined by the oppressive Georgia humidity. She looked frantic, terrified, and utterly stripped of her carefully manufactured dignity. She struggled to lift a box of shoes, dropping it heavily onto the concrete and wincing in pain. Elias was struggling to lift a heavy black trash bag filled with clothes into the back of the rented truck. His face was a sickly ashen gray, his posture stooped and broken under the crushing, inescapable weight of public humiliation. The towering, intimidating patriarch who used to strike fear into corporate boardrooms now looked like a fragile, defeated old man entirely out of his depth. The elite neighbors, the very people Yvonne had spent decades trying desperately to impress, dominate, and manipulate, were openly staring. A wealthy woman walking a pair of perfectly groomed poodles paused on the sidewalk, making absolutely no effort to hide her judgmental, calculating gaze. I watched my mother physically shrink under that gaze, retreating behind a stack of moving boxes to hide her flushed face. The impenetrable fortress she had built out of lies, stolen money, and societal intimidation was completely gone. She was finally experiencing the exact vulnerability and exposure she had forced upon me when she locked me out in the freezing rain with my hungry children. A sudden screech of tires drew my attention to the foot of the long driveway. A standard mid-tier Uber pulled up aggressively, and Tasha stormed out of the back seat. She marched up the cobblestones, completely ignoring my parents struggling with their boxes. Terrence stumbled out of the front doors to meet her, looking absolutely pathetic. He was wearing baggy, stained sweatpants, and the bulky black plastic of a federal tracking ankle monitor was clearly visible just above his sock. He reached out for his wife, his face contorted in a desperate, pleading mask. Tasha did not offer a comforting embrace or a shoulder to lean on. She screamed at him, her voice carrying sharply across the street, echoing off the multi-million-dollar mansions. Though I could not hear every word through the thick glass of the Maybach, her body language screamed of absolute betrayal and disgust. She berated him for lying, for losing the stolen money, for dragging her pristine reputation into a massive federal scandal. Terrence tried to grab her hands, begging her to stay, undoubtedly promising he could somehow fix a situation that was completely unfixable. Tasha responded by violently yanking her hands away from his grasp. She reached down, ripped the massive, obscenely expensive diamond wedding ring off her finger, and hurled it directly at his chest with incredible force. The heavy ring bounced off his collarbone and disappeared into the thick, manicured azalea bushes. Without a single backward glance, Tasha spun around on her designer heels, marched back down the long driveway, got into the waiting Uber, and drove away. She left Terrence standing on the cobblestones, sobbing into his hands while wearing a federal tracking device. I tapped the partition glass, catching my driver's attention. "Take us downtown," I instructed calmly. I had seen enough of the Buckhead eviction to satisfy my soul. As we cruised smoothly through the bustling, chaotic financial district of downtown Atlanta, the universe decided to offer one final, perfectly timed exhibit of absolute destruction. We stopped at a red light near the towering federal courthouse. Through the tinted passenger window, I spotted DeAndre. He was standing on the crowded, dirty sidewalk, arguing frantically with two men in cheap, ill-fitting suits, who looked exactly like overworked, underpaid, court-appointed public defenders. The high-powered, obscenely expensive legal team he used to boast about at society dinners was long gone, having completely abandoned him the exact second the government froze his assets. DeAndre looked completely unhinged and entirely unrecognizable. His expensive silk tie was missing, the top buttons of his custom-tailored shirt were torn open, and his usually immaculate, perfectly styled hair was a chaotic, sweaty mess. He was waving his arms aggressively, his face red with panic, looking far more like a manic street preacher than a prominent, highly respected corporate attorney. He looked desperate, cornered, and terrified. I scanned the busy area around him, watching the pedestrian traffic flow past his meltdown. Sasha, the heavily pregnant, deeply calculating mistress, who had practically glued herself to his arm when she thought he was successfully claiming half of $1 billion empire, was nowhere to be seen. The very moment the money evaporated and the federal charges materialized, she had vanished completely into the wind. She had left him standing on the sidewalk to face a devastating federal indictment entirely alone, stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his leverage. I did not roll down the window to gloat at his misery. I did not taunt him or revel out loud in his absolute, inescapable ruin. I simply pressed the button on my armrest, ensuring the heavily tinted window was completely sealed, shutting out the pathetic noise of his total downfall. I leaned back against the plush headrest and picked up my phone. I bypassed my corporate email and opened my highly secure encrypted personal banking application. I navigated past the billions in corporate holdings, past the massive investment portfolios, and accessed my private accounts. I pulled up a specific mental calculation I had carried with me for years. It was the exact figure my family had stolen from my college fund, the money they had ruthlessly drained to finance my brother's failed business ventures and my sister's lavish, empty lifestyle. I typed that original stolen amount into the transfer screen. I did not just reimburse myself. I took that figure and multiplied it by 1,000%. With a few swift, deliberate keystrokes, I transferred those massive, staggering funds out of my primary accounts and directly into 3 separate, completely irrevocable, ironclad trusts. One for each of my beautiful, resilient children. I set the legal and financial parameters so tightly that no one, not a future spouse, not a distant relative, not a single predatory force could ever touch a single dime of it without their explicit consent. I was securing their futures with absolute permanence. I was ensuring that they would never, ever experience the terror of financial vulnerability that I had endured. I was breaking the toxic, manipulative, generational curse of the Williams family and building a massive fortress of true, untouchable security for the people I actually loved. The satisfaction that bloomed in my chest was warmer and more profound than any corporate acquisition could ever provide. As the banking confirmation screen illuminated with 3 bright green checkmarks signaling the transfers were officially locked, an incoming call interrupted the display. The caller ID flashed brightly with the official unmistakable seal of the municipal government. It was the mayor of Atlanta. I answered the call, my voice perfectly steady, calm, and professional. Ms. Williams, the mayor, said, his tone carrying a profound level of respect and genuine deference that he had never afforded my father or my ex-husband. We have been closely watching your incredible transformative work with Apex Holdings and Aegis AI. We would be deeply honored if you would accept the award for Businesswoman of the Year at next week's highly anticipated city banquet. I looked out the window, watching the towering, glittering skyscrapers of the Atlanta skyline roll past my tinted window. The city belonged to me now. I smiled, a genuine, quiet expression of total, undisputed victory. I will be there. The line disconnected, leaving only the soft, powerful hum of the Maybach engine as we glided smoothly through the vibrant streets of the city I had just conquered. 6 months later, that quiet, isolated victory inside the back of a luxury vehicle had fully materialized into an impenetrable physical reality. I sat at the head of a massive, polished obsidian boardroom table, bathed in the crisp, natural light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new high-tech headquarters. The Apex Holdings Tower was a soaring monument of glass and steel, completely dominating the Atlanta skyline. It was the physical manifestation of everything I had built from the ground up, standing exactly where the Williams family empire had once cast its suffocating shadow. The room was filled with the brightest minds in the tech and logistics industries. Dozens of highly educated, fiercely loyal executives sat around the table, their eyes locked entirely on me. There was no condescension here. There were no arrogant smirks, no dismissive interruptions, and absolutely no one questioning my authority or my intellect. When I spoke, the room fell silent. They hung on my every word, furiously taking notes as I effortlessly dismantled complex logistical bottlenecks and mapped out our global expansion strategy using the latest iterations of the Aegis AI algorithm. I was respected. I was powerful. I was finally surrounded by a dedicated team that valued my mind, celebrating the exact brilliance my family had spent 30 years desperately trying to suppress. Excellent work on the European integration, David, I said, addressing my chief operating officer with a firm, approving nod. Execute the final phase by Tuesday morning, meeting adjourned. The executives packed up their sleek laptops and filed out of the boardroom, offering respectful nods and quiet murmurs of agreement as they left. Within moments, the cavernous room was entirely empty, leaving me alone with the breathtaking panoramic view of the city. I reached out and picked up my slim custom-encrypted tablet from the polished table. I tapped the screen, opening my daily executive briefing. Alongside the staggering profit margins and global market shares, a specialized automated news tracker aggregated updates on specific individuals. I took a slow sip of my coffee and reviewed the morning clippings. The first headline featured a highly unflattering, poorly lit photograph of my older brother. Terrence had officially been sentenced yesterday afternoon. Despite his frantic sobbing in the courtroom and his desperate attempts to strike a plea deal, the federal judge had shown absolutely zero leniency. He was handed a harsh mandatory 4-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. There was no early parole. There were no country club prison accommodations. The arrogant golden child of the Williams family was currently trading in his custom Italian silk suits for a stiff, scratchy state-issued uniform. I swiped down to the next local update. It was a brief real estate and municipal bulletin, but my algorithm had flagged the specific names. Yvonne and Elias Williams had officially exhausted their final appeals and emergency loans. With their bank accounts frozen and their social network entirely evaporated, the former king and queen of Atlanta, high society had been forced to relocate to the only place they could afford, without credit or leverage. They were currently living in a tiny, cramped, deeply unmaintained 2-bedroom apartment in one of the most notoriously dangerous, dilapidated sectors of the city. The irony of their new address was nothing short of poetic. Their crumbling apartment complex shared a chain-link fence with the Starlight Motel. It was the exact same cheap, run-down motel my mother had aggressively told me to go to when I stood on her pristine porch, soaking wet and begging for shelter for my hungry children. Now, Yvonne was forced to listen to the flickering neon signs and police sirens of that very motel through her paper-thin bedroom walls every single night. I scrolled to the final update. DeAndre had managed to avoid federal prison by liquidating absolutely everything he had ever touched and agreeing to a crushing, lifelong restitution plan. The Internal Revenue Service had decimated him. To comply with his strict court-ordered payment schedule and avoid immediate incarceration, the formerly boastful, manipulative attorney was now working a grueling minimum wage job. He was employed on the graveyard shift at a massive regional distribution warehouse, spending 10 hours a night hauling heavy cardboard boxes onto wooden pallets. His designer shoes had been replaced by heavy steel-toed work boots that left his feet covered in bleeding blisters. He was trapped in a relentless, inescapable cycle of hard labor and total poverty, his wages aggressively garnished by the government before he even saw a single paycheck. I did not laugh. I did not gloat out loud or feel the need to broadcast their misery. I simply tapped the power button, letting the screen go black. The silence of the boardroom was incredibly peaceful. I opened my secure financial application. I looked at the vast, unimaginable wealth generated by my companies. I bypassed the corporate accounts and opened my private trusts. With a few deliberate taps, I authorized a massive transfer. I moved the exact precise amount of the college fund my family had stolen from me, plus 1,000% interest directly into three separate, irrevocable, ironclad accounts. One for each of my children. I secured the funds with a legal framework so aggressive and unyielding that no one could ever access the money without their explicit authorization. I was ensuring that the generational curse of manipulation, theft, and scarcity was completely eradicated. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open. "Mommy!" The joyful, uninhibited shout shattered the quiet executive atmosphere. My three children burst into the room, their faces glowing with pure, radiant happiness. They sprinted across the expensive carpet, their laughter echoing off the glass walls as they threw themselves at me. I dropped to my knees, catching them in a massive, overwhelming embrace. I buried my face in their hair, breathing in the scent of their shampoo. They were wearing comfortable premium clothes, their bellies were full, and their eyes were bright with total absolute security. They were safe. They were wealthy. And above all else, they were unconditionally loved. I stood up, holding my youngest daughter in my arms, and walked over to the towering glass window. I looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, holding my children close against my chest. The city was a glittering grid of endless opportunity, and I held the keys to all of it. They laughed at me when I had nothing. They locked the door when I needed shelter. They thought throwing me into the dirt would bury me, but they forgot one crucial thing. I am not a seed to be buried. I am the architect of my own empire. They told me I was a failure. I told them, watch me build, and now they work for me.